In the final, desperate days of World War II, Berlin became a city of nightmares, where the very essence of humanity seemed to unravel. As the Soviet Red Army stormed the heart of Nazi Germany, what unfolded was not just the fall of a regime but the descent into an abyss of violence and despair. The streets of Berlin, once the epicenter of Hitler's ambitions, were now the stage for one of the most harrowing chapters in human history. Here, amid the crumbling ruins and the relentless bombardment, the true horrors of war were laid bare, not just in the clash of armies, but in the suffering of civilians caught in the crossfire. As the Soviet forces closed in, vengeance, fear, and chaos consumed the city, leaving a legacy of trauma and devastation that would haunt the world for generations. End of World War II. As World War II was nearing its end, the Battle of Berlin was one of the most brutal confrontations, with the Soviet Red Army invading the heart of Nazi Germany. As the sun began to set on the era of World War II, the world stood on the precipice of an uncertain future. The Battle of Berlin, one of the final and most brutal confrontations of the war, marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The Soviet Red Army, a force that had endured unimaginable hardships and losses over the course of the war, was now closing in on the heart of the Nazi regime. The significance of this battle was immense. It was not just about the military defeat of Germany but about avenging the unspeakable atrocities committed during the Holocaust. The fall of Berlin symbolized the collapse of a regime that had brought death and destruction on an unprecedented scale, and the Red Army was determined to make the Nazis pay for every crime they had committed. The Soviet advance into Berlin was relentless and unyielding. The soldiers of the Red Army, many of whom had witnessed the horrors of Auschwitz and other concentration camps firsthand, were driven by a deep-seated desire for revenge. They had fought their way across Eastern Europe, liberating towns and cities that had been under Nazi occupation for years, and now they were within striking distance of the ultimate prize, the capital of the Third Reich. The German defenders, though outnumbered and outgunned, were prepared to fight to the death. They knew that surrendering to the Soviets could mean torture, execution, or worse, particularly for those who had been directly involved in the Holocaust. The battle that ensued was one of the most intense and destructive of the entire war, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The streets of Berlin became a nightmarish landscape of devastation. Buildings that had once been symbols of Nazi power and grandeur were reduced to rubble by the relentless Soviet bombardment. The city's infrastructure, already weakened by years of Allied bombing raids, crumbled under the weight of the assault. The once mighty Wehrmacht, now a shadow of its former self, struggled to hold back the tide of Soviet soldiers pouring into the city. The fighting was brutal and often hand-to-hand, with both sides resorting to any means necessary to gain the upper hand. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning buildings, while the sounds of gunfire and explosions echoed through the streets. For the German civilians caught in the crossfire, the Battle of Berlin was a living hell. As the Red Army advanced, thousands of Berliners fled their homes in search of safety, only to find that there was nowhere to hide. The city's once bustling streets were now filled with the desperate and the displaced, as families huddled together in basements and bomb shelters, praying for the nightmare to end. The Soviet soldiers, many of whom had lost loved ones to the Nazis' genocidal policies, showed little mercy to the German population. Stories of atrocities committed by the Red Army, including mass executions and widespread sexual violence, spread quickly through the city, adding to the terror that gripped the civilian population. The fall of Berlin was not just the end of a battle, it was the end of an era. The Nazi regime, which had once seemed invincible, was now in its death throes, its leaders either dead, captured, or on the run. Adolf Hitler, the man who had plunged the world into war, took his own life in his bunker beneath the city, unwilling to face the consequences of his actions. The remaining German forces, realizing that the war was lost, began to surrender en masse, though some continued to fight on, either out of loyalty to the regime or fear of retribution from the Soviets. The once proud city of Berlin was now a smoking ruin, its streets littered with the bodies of soldiers and civilians alike. In the aftermath of the battle, the world would come to learn of the full extent of the atrocities committed by the Nazis. The liberation of Auschwitz and other concentration camps revealed the true horror of the Holocaust, with the survivors bearing witness to the unimaginable suffering they had endured. The Red Army, which had played a key role in ending the war, was hailed as a liberator by many, but the brutality of their actions in Berlin would leave a lasting stain on their legacy. The battle had been won, but the cost was staggering, both in terms of human lives and the moral toll it took on those who had fought in it. The strategic importance of the Battle of Berlin cannot be overstated. The city was not only the capital of Nazi Germany but also the center of its military and political power. The capture of Berlin by the Soviets effectively signaled the end of the Third Reich and paved the way for the Allied victory in Europe. However, the battle also marked the beginning of a new era of geopolitical tensions, as the Soviet Union and the Western Allies began to jockey for influence in the post-war world. The division of Berlin into sectors controlled by the Soviet Union, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France would eventually lead to the Cold War and the construction of the Berlin Wall, a symbol of the ideological divide that would define the second half of the 20th century. The human cost of the Battle of Berlin was immense. It is estimated that over 300,000 people, including soldiers and civilians, lost their lives during the battle. The destruction of the city was almost total, with over 1 million people left homeless. The psychological impact on the survivors was profound, particularly for the women who had suffered at the hands of the Soviet soldiers. The trauma of the assaults would haunt them for the rest of their lives, a grim reminder of the horrors of war and the depths of human cruelty. For many, the end of the war brought little relief, as they faced the daunting task of rebuilding their lives in a city that had been reduced to ruins. In the larger context of World War II, the Battle of Berlin was a fitting, if tragic, conclusion to a conflict that had brought so much death and destruction to the world. The war had begun with Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939, a bold and ruthless move that set the stage for 6 years of global conflict. Now, in 1945, the tables had turned, and it was Germany that was under siege, its cities bombed into submission, its armies defeated, and its people suffering the consequences of the crimes committed in their name. The Battle of Berlin was not just a military victory for the Allies. It was a moral reckoning for a nation that had allowed itself to be led down the path of tyranny and genocide. For the Soviet Union, the victory in Berlin was a source of immense pride. The Red Army had borne the brunt of the fighting on the Eastern Front, suffering millions of casualties in the process, and their capture of Berlin was seen as the ultimate vindication of their sacrifices. However, the victory was also tinged with bitterness, as the atrocities committed by Soviet soldiers during the battle became known to the world. The Soviet leadership, including Joseph Stalin, sought to downplay these actions, but the truth could not be fully suppressed. The Red Army's role in ending the war was undeniable, but so too was the brutality with which they had conducted themselves in Berlin. As the world looked on in horror at the destruction of Berlin, there was a growing recognition that the end of World War II would not bring an end to the suffering. The war had left deep scars on the global community, and the task of rebuilding, both physically and morally, would be long and difficult. The lessons of the Holocaust, Auschwitz, and the Battle of Berlin would need to be remembered and internalized if humanity was to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. The world had been forever changed by the events of the war, and the challenge now was to ensure that the horrors of those years were never forgotten. The Battle of Berlin, with all its brutality and destruction, serves as a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked power and the dangers of ideology taken to its extreme. The fall of Berlin marked the end of one of the darkest chapters in human history, but it also opened the door to a new era of hope and possibility. As the city began to rebuild from the ashes, there was a sense that, perhaps, something good could emerge from the ruins, a future where the values of democracy, human rights, and peace could take root and flourish. The battle had been won, but the true victory would be in ensuring that the horrors of the past were never repeated. In the years that followed, Berlin would rise again, becoming a symbol of resilience and renewal. The scars of the Battle of Berlin would never fully heal, but the city would rebuild, its people determined to move forward while never forgetting the lessons of the past. The war had left a legacy of pain and loss, but it had also shown the strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. The story of Berlin, from the darkest days of World War II to the fall of the Berlin Wall, is a testament to the enduring power of hope and the belief that, even in the face of great evil, good can ultimately prevail. The Battle of Berlin was more than just the final confrontation of World War II. It was a moment of reckoning for the entire world. It was a reminder of the terrible cost of war and the need for vigilance in the defense of freedom and human dignity. As the guns fell silent and the city began to heal, the world was left to ponder the lessons of the past and the challenges of the future. The battle was over, but the work of building a better world had just begun. Soviet assault. The Soviet forces, motivated by revenge, committed numerous atrocities against German civilians, especially women, in Berlin, causing widespread suffering. As the Soviet forces breached the final defenses of Berlin, the city became a crucible of vengeance and violence. The soldiers of the Red Army, hardened by years of brutal combat and motivated by a deep desire for retribution, unleashed their fury on the German population. The atrocities committed during this assault were a grim reflection of the horrors that had been inflicted upon the Soviet Union by the Nazis, and they served as a dark counterbalance to the earlier crimes of the war. The Soviet assault on Berlin was not just a military operation. It was a psychological campaign designed to break the spirit of the German people and exact a terrible price for the suffering they had caused. The motivation behind the Soviet actions in Berlin was rooted in the unimaginable suffering that the Soviet people had endured during the war. The Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, known as Operation Barbarossa, had been one of the most devastating campaigns of World War II. Millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians had been killed, and entire cities had been reduced to rubble. The German occupation of Soviet territory was marked by atrocities on a massive scale, including mass executions, forced labor, and the systematic extermination of Jews and other minorities. The horrors of Auschwitz and other death camps were seared into the collective memory of the Soviet people, and when the Red Army finally reached Berlin, they were determined to make the Germans pay for their crimes. The Soviet leadership, including Joseph Stalin, had given tacit approval for the Red Army to exact revenge on the German population. This was not an official policy, but it was understood by the troops that they would not be held accountable for their actions in Berlin. The result was a wave of violence that swept through the city, with Soviet soldiers committing widespread acts of rape, murder, and looting. The primary targets of this violence were German women, who were subjected to mass sexual assault on a scale that has rarely been seen in modern history. It is estimated that as many as 2 million German women were raped by Soviet soldiers during and after the Battle of Berlin, with many of them being assaulted multiple times by different men. The trauma inflicted on these women was profound and lasting, and it remains one of the darkest chapters of the war. The scale of the sexual violence committed by Soviet soldiers in Berlin was staggering. Women of all ages, from young girls to elderly grandmothers, were targeted by the troops. Many were raped in front of their families, adding to the psychological torment. The rapes were often accompanied by acts of extreme brutality, with some women being beaten, mutilated, or even killed after the assault. The Red Army soldiers were often intoxicated, which exacerbated the violence. Alcohol was readily available in the city, and many soldiers drank heavily as a way to cope with the horrors they had witnessed and the guilt they felt for their actions. The combination of alcohol, anger, and a desire for revenge created a toxic environment where the normal rules of conduct no longer applied. The Soviet assault on Berlin was marked by a breakdown in military discipline. Despite efforts by some Soviet commanders to control their troops, the sheer scale of the violence made it impossible to enforce order. The chaos of the battle, combined with the overwhelming size of the Red Army, meant that many soldiers acted with impunity. Some officers turned a blind eye to the atrocities, while others actively participated in the looting and violence. The breakdown in discipline was not limited to the lower ranks. Even high-ranking officers were involved in the crimes. This lack of accountability created an atmosphere of lawlessness, where the strong preyed on the weak and the suffering of the German population was seen as justified retribution for the horrors of the Eastern Front. The psychological impact of the Soviet assault on Berlin was devastating. For the German civilians who had survived the bombing raids and the fighting, the arrival of the Red Army was a moment of terror. The stories of Soviet atrocities had preceded them, and many Berliners feared what would happen when the city fell. The reality of the Soviet occupation was even worse than they had imagined. Women lived in constant fear of being assaulted, and many went to great lengths to try to protect themselves. Some cut their hair short or dressed in old clothes to make themselves look less attractive, while others tried to hide or flee the city. These efforts were often in vain, as the Red Army soldiers were determined to exact their revenge. The suffering of the German civilians in Berlin was compounded by the complete collapse of the city's infrastructure. The Soviet bombardment had left much of Berlin in ruins, and there was little food, water, or medical care available. The looting by Soviet soldiers only made the situation worse, as they stripped the city of anything of value. The German population, already weakened by years of war and rationing, was now faced with the additional hardship of surviving in a city that had been utterly devastated. The combination of physical violence, hunger, and despair created a sense of hopelessness among the survivors, many of whom struggled to find the will to go on. The long-term consequences of the Soviet assault on Berlin were profound. The trauma inflicted on the German population, particularly the women who had been assaulted, had a lasting impact on the city's post-war recovery. Many women were left with physical and psychological scars that would never heal. Some were ostracized by their communities or families, while others suffered in silence, unable to speak about what had happened to them. The stigma associated with sexual violence was strong, and many women felt ashamed or guilty, even though they were the victims. The children born as a result of the rapes were often seen as a living reminder of the horrors of the war, and their mothers faced additional challenges in raising them in a society that was struggling to rebuild itself. The Soviet occupation of Berlin also had significant political implications. The Red Army's actions in Berlin, and in other parts of Germany, contributed to the growing tension between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies. The reports of Soviet atrocities, combined with the harsh treatment of the German population, fueled fears in the West of Soviet expansionism and aggression. These fears would eventually lead to the division of Germany and the start of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall, which was built in 1961, became the most visible symbol of this division, and the city remained a focal point of East-West tensions for decades. The atrocities committed by the Red Army in Berlin have been the subject of much debate and controversy. For many years, the Soviet Union denied or downplayed the extent of the violence, and it was not until after the fall of the Soviet Union that the full extent of the atrocities was acknowledged. Even today, the topic remains sensitive, with some Russian historians and officials seeking to minimize the Red Army's actions or justify them as a response to the horrors of the Nazi occupation. However, the evidence is overwhelming, and the suffering of the German civilians in Berlin cannot be ignored or dismissed. The Soviet assault on Berlin was a tragedy on many levels. It was a military victory that came at a tremendous human cost, both for the Soviet soldiers and the German civilians. The violence and suffering that took place during the assault were a stark reminder of the destructive power of war and the capacity for cruelty that exists in all of us. The Battle of Berlin, and the atrocities that accompanied it, should serve as a cautionary tale for future generations, a reminder of the importance of upholding human rights and the rule of law, even in the midst of conflict. The story of the Soviet assault on Berlin is not just a story of violence and revenge, it is also a story of survival and resilience. Despite the horrors they faced, many of the survivors of the battle went on to rebuild their lives and their city. Berlin, which had been reduced to rubble, rose again to become a symbol of unity and freedom. The women who had been assaulted, though deeply scarred, found ways to cope with their trauma and move forward. Their stories are a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the ability to overcome even the most terrible of circumstances. In the end, the Soviet assault on Berlin was a moment of profound tragedy and loss, but it was also a moment of transformation. The end of World War II marked the beginning of a new era, one in which the lessons of the past would shape the future. The suffering of the people of Berlin, and the atrocities committed by the Red Army, should never be forgotten. They serve as a reminder of the need for justice, compassion, and the protection of human dignity, even in the darkest of times. Discipline breakdown. Despite attempts to control their troops, the Soviet command's orders had little effect, leading to unchecked violence and assaults. The chaotic and violent environment that emerged during the Soviet assault on Berlin was, in part, a result of a significant breakdown in military discipline. Despite the Soviet command's efforts to maintain order among their troops, the sheer scale of the violence and the intense emotions at play rendered their commands largely ineffective. The orders from high-ranking Soviet officers, intended to curb the excesses of their soldiers, were often ignored or simply lost in the chaos of battle. The result was a city where law and order had completely disintegrated, and where the Red Army soldiers operated with near-total impunity, committing acts of violence that would haunt the survivors for years to come. The breakdown of discipline within the Red Army was not entirely unexpected, given the context of the war. The soldiers who made up the Soviet forces in Berlin were, by and large, exhausted and traumatized. Many had been fighting for years, enduring unimaginable hardships as they pushed the Nazis back across Eastern Europe. The propaganda that had fueled their fight emphasized the brutalities inflicted on the Soviet Union by the Germans, and the desire for revenge was deeply ingrained in the minds of the soldiers. This sense of vengeance, combined with the chaotic nature of urban warfare, created a perfect storm in which discipline became increasingly difficult to enforce. The Soviet command structure was itself under immense strain during the Battle of Berlin. The rapid advance of the Red Army into the city, coupled with the desperate German resistance, meant that communication lines were often stretched thin or completely severed. Orders from Soviet leaders like Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Ivan Konyev, who were tasked with capturing Berlin, often failed to reach the frontline troops in a timely manner. When orders did arrive, they were sometimes disregarded by soldiers who were more focused on exacting revenge than following military protocol. The sheer scale of the operation also meant that there were simply too many soldiers and too few officers to maintain effective control over every unit. The lack of discipline among Soviet troops manifested in numerous ways, most notably in the widespread violence against civilians. Soldiers, emboldened by the absence of strict oversight, engaged in looting, rape, and murder on a massive scale. The civilian population of Berlin, already suffering from the effects of prolonged warfare, became the primary victims of this unchecked aggression. Women, in particular, bore the brunt of the violence, as Soviet soldiers, often fueled by alcohol and rage, committed acts of sexual assault with little fear of retribution. The breakdown in discipline was so severe that in some cases, Soviet officers who attempted to intervene and stop the atrocities were ignored or even threatened by their own men. Efforts to restore order were sporadic and largely ineffective. Some Soviet commanders did attempt to rein in their troops, issuing orders that explicitly forbade the mistreatment of civilians. These orders, however, were often disregarded by soldiers who saw them as inconsistent with the rhetoric of revenge that had been used to motivate them throughout the war. In some instances, commanders resorted to drastic measures, such as executing soldiers who were caught committing atrocities, in an attempt to set an example. However, these actions were the exception rather than the rule, and the vast majority of the violence went unpunished. The breakdown of discipline within the Red Army was not just a failure of command, but also a reflection of the deep psychological scars left by years of brutal warfare. The psychological toll of the war on Soviet soldiers played a significant role in the collapse of discipline. Many soldiers had witnessed or participated in atrocities on the Eastern Front, where the war had been fought with a level of ferocity and cruelty that is difficult to comprehend. The Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union had been characterized by a campaign of terror against the civilian population, including mass executions, the burning of villages, and the use of starvation as a weapon of war. These experiences had hardened the Soviet soldiers, creating a mindset in which the concept of mercy had little place. By the time they reached Berlin, many soldiers saw the German civilians not as innocent victims, but as complicit in the crimes of the Nazi regime, deserving of punishment. Alcohol also played a significant role in the breakdown of discipline. The Red Army, like many armies throughout history, had a tradition of using alcohol to boost morale and help soldiers cope with the stress of combat. In Berlin, alcohol was readily available, either through looting or as part of the supplies distributed to the troops. Drunkenness among Soviet soldiers was rampant, exacerbating the violence and making it even more difficult for officers to maintain control. Drunk soldiers were more likely to engage in reckless behavior, including looting and assaulting civilians, and less likely to follow orders. The combination of alcohol and the pent-up rage that many soldiers felt created a volatile situation that was nearly impossible to contain. The consequences of the breakdown in discipline were far-reaching, affecting not only the immediate victims but also the post-war relations between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies. Reports of Soviet atrocities in Berlin, including the mass rapes and the looting of the city, quickly spread beyond the borders of Germany. These reports fueled anti-Soviet sentiment in the West and contributed to the growing distrust between the Soviet Union and its former allies. The Soviet leadership, keenly aware of the negative impact these actions could have on their international reputation, attempted to downplay or deny the extent of the violence. However, the sheer scale of the atrocities made it impossible to fully suppress the truth. In the years that followed, the Soviet Union would be forced to confront the legacy of the Battle of Berlin. The actions of the Red Army in Berlin became a point of contention in the emerging Cold War, with Western powers using the atrocities as evidence of Soviet brutality and aggression. Within the Soviet Union, the official narrative of the war focused on the heroism of the Red Army and the liberation of Europe from fascism, with little mention of the darker aspects of the campaign. It was not until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 that historians and the public were able to fully examine and discuss the extent of the atrocities committed in Berlin. The breakdown in discipline during the Soviet assault on Berlin is a stark reminder of the complex and often contradictory nature of war. On the one hand, the Red Army played a crucial role in defeating Nazi Germany and bringing an end to one of the most destructive conflicts in human history. On the other hand, the actions of some Soviet soldiers during the occupation of Berlin demonstrated the capacity for violence and cruelty that can emerge when the bonds of discipline and morality are broken. The story of the Soviet assault on Berlin is not just a story of military victory. It is also a story of human tragedy, a reminder of the profound costs of war and the need for vigilance in upholding the principles of humanity, even in the midst of conflict. The lessons of the Battle of Berlin and the breakdown of discipline that occurred during the Soviet assault are still relevant today. They serve as a powerful warning of the dangers of dehumanization and the corrosive effects of unchecked power. In any conflict, maintaining discipline and respect for human rights is essential, not only to protect the innocent but also to preserve the moral integrity of those who fight. The Soviet experience in Berlin illustrates the terrible consequences that can arise when these principles are abandoned, and it underscores the importance of leadership, accountability, and the rule of law in times of war. As historians continue to study the Battle of Berlin and the Soviet occupation, it is important to remember the broader context in which these events took place. The violence and atrocities committed by Soviet soldiers were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger pattern of brutality that characterized the entire Eastern Front. The breakdown of discipline in Berlin was both a symptom and a cause of the broader collapse of order that accompanied the end of World War II. It is a sobering reminder that even in the pursuit of a just cause, the means by which victory is achieved can have lasting and devastating consequences. Drunken rampage. Many Soviet soldiers, often intoxicated, committed horrific acts, with an estimated 2 million German women assaulted during and after the battle. The invasion of Berlin by the Soviet Red Army was marked not only by military aggression but also by widespread chaos fueled by rampant alcohol consumption among the troops. As the Soviet forces poured into the city, the discipline that had held them together during years of brutal combat began to unravel, giving way to a drunken rampage that left a scar on the German population. Alcohol, easily accessible due to looting and the collapse of social order, became both a coping mechanism and a catalyst for violence. In the haze of intoxication, the soldiers' pent-up rage, fueled by years of suffering and propaganda, was unleashed upon the defenseless civilians of Berlin, resulting in one of the darkest chapters of the post-war period. The availability of alcohol in Berlin was almost limitless, as the city's stores, homes, and even government buildings were plundered by the advancing Soviet troops. Soldiers, many of whom had been deprived of any form of comfort during the long and grueling campaigns on the Eastern Front, seized upon this newfound abundance with reckless abandon. The alcohol served as a temporary escape from the horrors they had witnessed and the atrocities they had committed, numbing their senses and lowering their inhibitions. Drunkenness became commonplace among the ranks, leading to a dramatic escalation in the level of violence perpetrated against the civilian population, particularly against women. The statistics are staggering and heartbreaking. It is estimated that up to 2 million German women were raped by Soviet soldiers during and immediately after the Battle of Berlin. This wave of sexual violence was not limited to any single group. Women of all ages, from young girls to elderly grandmothers, were subjected to brutal assaults. The drunken state of the soldiers often exacerbated the cruelty of these attacks, as they acted with complete disregard for the humanity of their victims. The assaults were not only acts of violence but also expressions of power and dominance, reflecting a deep-seated desire to humiliate and subjugate the German population. The widespread nature of these crimes meant that few women in Berlin were left untouched by the horror. The psychological and physical toll on the victims was immense. Many women suffered severe injuries as a result of the assaults, and the trauma they experienced would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In the immediate aftermath, some women took drastic measures to protect themselves, such as cutting their hair short or dressing in rags to appear less attractive to the soldiers. Others tried to hide in basements or among the ruins of the city, but few places offered true safety. The societal shame attached to rape further compounded the suffering of the victims, as many were unable to speak openly about what had happened to them. The stigma associated with these assaults often led to isolation and ostracism, even from their own families, leaving the victims to bear their pain in silence. The impact of the mass rapes in Berlin was not confined to the immediate aftermath of the war. The children born as a result of these assaults were often seen as children of the enemy, and their mothers faced additional challenges in a society that was struggling to rebuild itself from the ashes of war. Many of these children were raised in an environment of secrecy and shame, with their true parentage hidden or denied. The psychological scars left by these events were passed down through generations, affecting not only the direct victims but also their families and communities. The legacy of the Soviet rampage in Berlin is a painful reminder of the long-term consequences of war and the deep wounds that such violence can inflict on a society. The Soviet leadership, aware of the widespread nature of the assaults, made some attempts to address the issue, but these were largely ineffective. Officially, the Red Army Command issued orders to stop the rapes and other acts of violence, but these directives were often ignored by the rank-and-file soldiers. The chaotic conditions in Berlin, combined with the sheer size of the Soviet forces, made it nearly impossible to enforce discipline. Furthermore, the leadership's focus was primarily on securing victory and consolidating power in the newly captured territories, rather than addressing the humanitarian crisis unfolding in the city. As a result, the violence continued unabated for weeks, leaving a lasting legacy of fear and trauma in its wake. The consequences of the Soviet rampage in Berlin also had broader geopolitical implications. The atrocities committed by Soviet soldiers contributed to the deepening divide between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies, laying the groundwork for the Cold War. Reports of the mass rapes and other crimes committed by the Red Army spread quickly, fueling anti-Soviet sentiment in the West and casting a shadow over the Soviet Union's victory in Europe. The narrative of the Red Army as liberators was severely tarnished by the actions of its soldiers in Berlin, and the Soviet leadership's attempts to downplay or deny the extent of the violence only served to deepen the mistrust between East and West. In the post-war years, the Soviet Union largely succeeded in suppressing discussion of the atrocities committed by its soldiers, both within its own borders and in the countries it occupied. The official narrative focused on the heroism of the Red Army and the liberation of Europe from fascism, with little mention of the darker aspects of the occupation. However, the stories of the victims could not be completely silenced. In the decades that followed, survivors began to speak out about their experiences, and historians uncovered evidence that shed light on the true scale of the violence. These revelations forced a re-evaluation of the Soviet role in the war and the moral complexities of the Allied victory. The story of the drunken rampage in Berlin is a stark illustration of how the horrors of war can corrupt even those who see themselves as fighting for a just cause. The Red Army, which had been instrumental in defeating Nazi Germany and ending the Holocaust, became, in the chaos of Berlin, an instrument of terror in its own right. The soldiers who committed these atrocities were not inherently evil. They were products of a brutalizing environment that stripped them of their humanity and allowed them to commit acts that they might never have imagined themselves capable of. The failure of discipline within the Soviet ranks, exacerbated by alcohol and the desire for revenge, turned what could have been a moment of triumph into one of tragedy. For the survivors of the Soviet rampage in Berlin, the end of the war did not bring peace or closure. The trauma of what they had endured continued to affect their lives in profound ways, shaping their relationships, their sense of self, and their view of the world. Many struggled with feelings of shame, guilt, and anger, emotions that were compounded by the lack of recognition or justice for what they had suffered. The silence that surrounded their experiences only deepened their isolation, making it difficult for them to heal. It was only in the later years of their lives, as the taboo around discussing these events began to lift, that some of the survivors found the courage to share their stories. The events in Berlin also serve as a powerful reminder of the need for accountability in war. The lack of consequences for the Soviet soldiers who committed these crimes highlights the challenges of enforcing the laws of war in the chaos of conflict. While the Nuremberg trials held Nazi leaders accountable for their actions, there was no equivalent process for the Soviet soldiers who had perpetrated atrocities in Berlin and elsewhere. This lack of justice has left a lingering sense of injustice for the victims and their descendants, and it underscores the importance of holding all parties to a conflict to the same standards of conduct. In reflecting on the drunken rampage in Berlin, it is important to remember that the actions of the Soviet soldiers were not inevitable. They were the result of specific conditions, both psychological and material, that created an environment in which such behavior could occur. Understanding these conditions can help us prevent similar atrocities in the future. This means not only addressing the immediate factors, such as alcohol abuse and poor discipline, but also tackling the deeper issues, such as the dehumanization of the enemy and the psychological toll of prolonged combat. By learning from the past, we can hope to create a future in which the horrors of Berlin are never repeated. The legacy of the Soviet rampage in Berlin is one of pain and sorrow, but it is also one of resilience. The survivors of this terrible time, despite the immense suffering they endured, found ways to rebuild their lives and their city. Berlin, which had been reduced to ruins, rose again to become a symbol of unity and renewal. The women who were assaulted faced unimaginable challenges, but many of them were able to overcome the trauma and live full lives. Their stories are a testament to the strength of the human spirit and a reminder that, even in the darkest of times, hope and courage can prevail. Conclusion. The fall of Berlin in the final days of World War II was a turning point in history, a moment when the world was forced to confront the full extent of human cruelty and the devastating consequences of unchecked power. The battle itself was a brutal and relentless onslaught, but the true horror lay in the suffering of the civilians, particularly the women who were subjected to unimaginable violence at the hands of the Soviet soldiers. The atrocities committed during the Soviet occupation of Berlin are a somber reminder that even in the pursuit of justice, the lines between right and wrong can become dangerously blurred. As we reflect on these events, it is crucial to consider the lasting impact of such violence, not just on the individuals who endured it, but on society as a whole. The trauma inflicted on the survivors of Berlin did not end with the war. It echoed through the decades, shaping the lives of those who lived through it and influencing the course of history in profound ways. The physical scars may have healed, but the psychological wounds often remained, affecting relationships, communities, and even future generations. This legacy of pain and resilience underscores the importance of remembering these stories, not only to honor the victims but also to ensure that such atrocities are never repeated. The lessons of Berlin extend far beyond the immediate aftermath of World War II. They challenge us to think critically about the nature of war, the responsibility of those in power, and the ways in which we, as a global community, respond to the suffering of others. The survivors' stories serve as a powerful testament to the strength of the human spirit, but they also raise difficult questions about justice, accountability, and the role of memory in shaping our understanding of the past. How do we ensure that the voices of those who have suffered are heard and respected? What can we do to prevent the recurrence of such violence in the future? In a world that continues to grapple with conflict and division, these questions are more relevant than ever. The events in Berlin remind us that the scars of war are deep and enduring, and that the path to healing requires not only acknowledgement and remembrance but also a commitment to building a more just and compassionate world. As we look to the future, we must ask ourselves, how can we, as individuals and as a society, learn from the past to create a future where the horrors of Berlin are never repeated? How can we ensure that the lessons of history are not forgotten, but are instead used to guide us towards a more peaceful and equitable world? These are questions that challenge us to think deeply about our values, our actions, and our responsibilities to one another. They ask us to confront the uncomfortable truths of our history and to consider what we can do, in our own lives and communities, to make a difference. As you reflect on the stories of the survivors of Berlin, consider how their experiences might inform your own understanding of the world, and ask yourself, what role can I play in ensuring that the lessons of the past are not lost, but are used to build a better future?